There is someone inside you who has been watching, not judging exactly, not the harsh inner voice you already know about, the one that lists your failures at 3 in the morning, something quieter than that. A presence that has stood, calm and unhurried, behind every decision you have ever made. It watched you choose the safe school. It watched you take the job your father approved of and marry the person everyone called sensible. It watched you swallow the thing you wanted to say at the dinner that mattered most. And it watched you smile when you wanted to weep. And it has watched you, year after year, build a life out of other people's answers to the question of who you are. And it has disagreed with almost all of it. Not loudly. It does not argue. It simply waits, with a patience that has outlasted every phase you have passed through, for the day you finally stop asking everyone else who you are supposed to be and turn around to ask the one who has known the whole time. Carl Jung spent the last decades of his life describing this presence, and he came to believe it was the single most important discovery a human being can make. He called it the self. Not the self you mean when you say myself, the anxious bundle of preferences and fears and opinions you carry around all day. Something deeper than that, and older, a center that is not the same as your everyday mind, a kind of inner authority that has been quietly trying to live you from underneath the whole time you were busy living someone else's idea of your life. Jung said that turning to face it, learning to take its counsel instead of overruling it with should, is the actual work of a human life. He gave that work a name too. He called it individuation. And he warned that most people never begin it because they spend their entire lives mistaking the manager for the owner. By the end of this, you will understand who that quiet inner witness actually is, why it has disagreed with so much of the life you carefully assembled, and how it has been trying to reach you all along through the side door of your dreams. You will learn why the feeling that you never really lived, that someone else made all your choices, is not depression and not ingratitude, but a precise signal, the most important one your psyche knows how to send. And you will learn what it costs to finally answer it. But there is a part Jung would have you sit with that is harder than the regret. And it is this: the someone else who made all your choices was never out there. It was a part of you that you handed the throne to so long ago that you forgot the throne was yours, and taking it back will disappoint nearly everyone who loved the version of you that kept it warm for them. If this is already touching something you have carried in silence, I would ask you to do one small thing before we go down into it. Leave a comment about the moment you first suspected your life was being lived by someone other than you, a decision you made that you knew even then was not really yours. Not as a complaint, but because naming it out loud begins to loosen its grip. If this speaks to a quiet you don't usually let anyone see, let me know with a like. And if there is someone in your life who did everything right and still seems to be waiting for their real life to begin, send this to them. It may be the first time they hear that the waiting itself was the message. Let me tell you about a woman in her late 60s, 68 to be exact, recently retired after 40 years of teaching the same grade in the same town. A woman so reliable that 3 generations of that town learned to read in her classroom. If you met her, you would call her a success by every ordinary measure. She raised 2 children who turned out well. She stayed married to a decent man until he died, 4 years before this story finds her. She kept a clean house and a kind reputation and a calendar full of the small duties that make a person seem, from the outside, like someone who knows exactly who she is. She did everything right. That is the phrase she uses when she lets herself speak honestly, and she says it with a flatness that should frighten anyone listening. I did everything right. And yet, sitting alone in the quiet house in the first year that nothing was required of her, she was visited by a feeling she had no name for and no defense against. It was not grief for her husband, though that was there too. It was something stranger and more total. It was the dawning, unbearable sense that she had not actually been present for her own life, that she had moved through 68 years like a guest in someone else's house, polite and careful, touching nothing, claiming nothing, and that now the visit was nearly over and she could not for the life of her remember a single hour that had been truly, unmistakably hers. She would stand at the kitchen window, and a question would rise in her that she could barely stand to hold. Whose life was that? Because it did not feel like hers. It felt like a life that had been assembled for her by committee. Every major decision arrived at by consulting what a good daughter does, what a sensible woman chooses, what people would think, and she had been so busy being the person all those voices approved of that she had never once stopped to ask the only question that mattered. What did she want? She scanned back across the decades looking for the answer and found in its place only the long, unbroken record of her obedience. This is where Jung hands us the first piece of the map, and to find it we have to understand a distinction that almost no one is taught, though everything depends on it. There is the ego, and there is the self, and they are not the same thing. The ego is the part of you that says, I. It is the center of your everyday awareness, the manager of your waking life, the one that makes plans and remembers your name and worries about the future. It is necessary, and it is useful, and it is also, Jung insisted, not the whole of you. It is more like a small lit room in a vast dark house. The ego thinks it is the house. It walks around its little lit room, arranging the furniture, and believes it is in charge of everything. But the house is enormous, and most of it is in darkness, and somewhere deep in that darkness is the true center of the whole structure, the architect who drew the house in the first place. That center is what Jung meant by the self. And the great tragedy of an ordinary life, he said, is that the little manager in the lit room spends 70 or 80 years convinced that it is the owner, never once suspecting that there is a deeper authority in the dark who has been waiting patiently to be consulted. The schoolteacher had lived her entire life from the lit room. Every choice she could remember had been made by the anxious manager, the part of her that asked what would keep her safe, what would keep the love coming, what would keep the disapproval at bay. And the manager had done its job superbly. It had kept her safe. It had kept her approved of. It had built a life so unobjectionable that not one person in her town could have named a thing wrong with it. The only problem, the single fatal problem, was that the owner had never been allowed to live in the house at all. The architect had drawn no lines. Every room had been furnished by the committee, and the woman who actually was the center of it all had been standing in the dark hallway for 68 years, watching, disagreeing, and never once invited in. But here is the thing about the part of you that has been exiled to the dark hallway. It does not give up. It cannot, because it is not a mood or a phase or a passing wish. It is the center of who you are. And the center does not stop trying to reach the lit room just because the manager refuses to open the door. It only changes its method. When the daylight mind will not listen, it waits until the daylight mind is asleep, and then it comes in through the one door that cannot be locked. It comes in through the dream. And so the dreams began. Or rather, one dream began. The same dream, returning night after night with the patient insistence of something that has decided it will not be ignored any longer. In the dream, she is in a house she somehow knows is hers, though it is larger and older than any house she ever lived in, with rooms she has never entered. And in one of those rooms, there is a figure waiting for her. Not her husband, not her mother or her father, not anyone she has ever met. The figure is calm in a way that no one in her waking life has ever been calm, and it looks at her with an expression she has no word for, something between recognition and sorrow and a kind of terrible tenderness, as though it has known her for a very long time and has been waiting, with infinite patience, for her to finally walk into the room. In some versions of the dream, the figure is an old woman. In some, it is neither man nor woman, simply a presence. But it is always the same presence, and it always seems to know her completely, better than she has ever known herself. And every time, just before it speaks, she wakes. She told no one about the dream. What was there to tell? But it would not leave her. And after the third or fourth time, she began to feel something she had not felt in years, which was curiosity. Who was that? Why did it feel less like a stranger than anyone she actually knew? Why did walking toward it in the dream fill her not with fear, but with the strangest, most painful longing, the way you long for a home you can't remember ever having lived in? Jung would have told her exactly who it was, because he had spent his life learning the language those dreams are written in. He understood, against the entire spirit of his age, that dreams are not random noise, and they are not coded confessions of shameful wishes. They are the deep psyche speaking plainly, in the only language it has, the language of image, saying the thing the daylight mind refuses to hear. And he observed that at the great turning points of a life, the psyche often sends a particular kind of dream in which a figure appears who carries an authority and a wholeness that the dreamer's ordinary ego does not possess, a figure who seems to know. Jung came to understand that this figure is the dreamer's own deepest center, the self, personified, dressed up by the dreaming mind as a wise stranger so that the ego can finally meet what it has spent a lifetime ignoring. The calm presence in the unentered room was not a visitor from outside her. It was the owner of the house, finally caught on camera. It was who she would have been, if she had ever once been allowed to choose. Jung noticed something else about these dreams, something the school teacher could feel even before she understood it, and it is the detail that separates them from ordinary dreaming. The figure of the self does not scold. It does not arrive to punish you for the life you failed to live. The harsh inner voice she already knew, the one that catalogued her shortcomings in the small hours, was not this presence at all. That voice was just the committee, still in session, still casting its votes from inside her own head. The figure in the room was different in kind. It carried no contempt and no demand, only that strange tenderness, and Jung understood why. The deep center is not interested in your guilt. Guilt belongs to the manager, who is forever measuring you against the committee's standard. The self is measuring you against nothing. It is simply, patiently, holding up the image of who you actually are, and waiting. And this is precisely why so many people flee the dream, why she woke each time just before the figure could speak. Because the manager understands, on some level, that if the owner ever finishes its sentence, the manager's reign is over. The ego will tolerate almost anything before it will tolerate that. It would rather you have 1,000 anxious nights cataloging your faults than one quiet night in which the deep self finally tells you who you are, because the first keeps the manager in charge and the second ends its rule forever. Now hold that image because it explains the entire ache she could not name. The reason she felt she had never lived was not that her life had been empty, it had been full. It was that the one who was supposed to be living it had never been at the wheel. There is a kind of suffering, Jung saw, that does not come from anything being wrong on the surface. It comes from a life lived entirely from the lit room, a life in which the deep center has been so completely overruled, so consistently outvoted by should and sensible and what people will think, that the person ends up rich in accomplishments and starving at the core. He had a blunt way of pointing at this. He said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And the word that matters in that sentence is privilege, because most people, he believed, never claim it. They become who they were told to be, and they call it a life. And only in the quiet afterward, the way it came to the school teacher at her kitchen window, does the bill arrive. To understand how a person hands away the throne of their own life, you have to go back, as you almost always do, to a room they had no power to leave. The capacity to overrule yourself is not something you are born with. It is something you are taught early by people who needed you to be a certain way, and the school teacher's training had begun before she could read. She grew up the eldest daughter in a house run on a single unspoken rule, which was that her job was to be good, not happy. Good. Her mother was a woman of rigid propriety who measured every action by what the neighbors would think, and her father was a man who showed love only when his children behaved and withdrew it completely the instant they did not. So the girl learned the lesson all such children learn, the lesson that becomes the architecture of an entire life. She learned that her own wanting was dangerous, that the safe move, the only move, was to find out what the people around her approved of, and to become that as quickly and completely as possible. She became an expert reader of other people's expectations and a stranger to her own desires, and she was rewarded for it at every turn, and so she never thought to question it. By the time she was 10, she had a finely tuned instrument inside her for detecting what others wanted. By the time she was 20, she had no idea what she wanted herself, and had stopped noticing the absence. And here is the cruelty woven through it, the same cruelty that runs under so many careful lives. The instrument that erased her was also the instrument that made her beloved. The same hypersensitivity to others' approval that buried her own center made her the most accommodating daughter, the most reliable wife, the most beloved teacher in the county. Every time she chose the committee over herself, the committee rewarded her for it. The world adores a person who has handed away their throne because such a person is endlessly useful, endlessly available, endlessly easy to fit into the shape you need them to be. No one ever told her she was disappearing. They told her she was wonderful. And each piece of praise was another vote for the manager and against the owner, until the owner had been outvoted so many times that she stopped expecting a hearing and retreated to the dark hallway to wait. This is what I would call the tyranny of should. It is the most respectable tyranny there is, because it never looks like oppression. It looks like virtue. The voice of should does not announce itself as the thing that is stealing your life. It announces itself as conscience, as maturity, as responsibility, as the very thing that makes you a good person. A good daughter would, a sensible woman should, people would think. And because it wears the mask of goodness, you do not fight it. You thank it. You build your whole identity on obedience to it, and you call that identity your character, never suspecting that character built entirely out of should is not character at all. It is a costume the manager sewed to please the committee, and underneath it, the owner of the house is silent and unfed. I want you to see for a moment that this is not only the affliction of the careful and the old, because the trap of the lit room catches the bold just as completely, only it dresses differently. There was a man the school teacher's son knew, a man in his early 40s, the opposite of her in every visible way. Where she had been obedient, he had been ambitious. Where she had played small, he had played to win. And by 40, he had won everything the world tells a man to want: the company, the title, the house with the view. And he too, sitting in the middle of all that success, was visited by the same flat horror, the same unanswerable question rising up from underneath. Whose life is this? Because his choices, every one of them, had been made by his own committee. Only his committee did not say be good. It said be impressive. It said win. It said do not, under any circumstances, be ordinary. He had handed his throne to a manager just as surely as she had, a manager whose entire program was the relentless pursuit of more, and the deep center of him, the architect, had been overruled by ambition exactly as completely as hers had been overruled by propriety. The self does not care whether you buried it under obedience or under achievement. It only knows that it has not been allowed to live, and it will send the same dawning emptiness to a corner office that it sends to a quiet kitchen, because the lit room is the lit room whether it is decorated with humility or with trophies. This is what makes the trap so total. You can spend your whole life rebelling against the committee that raised you and discover, at 40 or 60, that rebellion was just obedience wearing the opposite coat, that you were still letting something other than your own center decide who you would be. But Jung saw something even more disturbing than the theft, and it is the part that should stop you cold, because it is the hidden price of a life run from the lit room. He observed that the energy of the self, the deep center, does not simply evaporate when it is ignored. Energy never does. It has to go somewhere. And when the deepest part of a person is denied any conscious expression, it does not die quietly in the dark hallway. It turns, over the years, into symptoms. It becomes the depression that descends, for no reason, a successful person can name. It becomes the anxiety that has no object, the chronic low-grade emptiness, the strange flatness in the middle of a life that looks, on paper, like everything a person could want. It becomes eventually the feeling that visited the school teacher at her window, the unbearable sense of never having lived. Jung understood that this suffering is not a malfunction. It is the self knocking. The very symptoms we rush to medicate away are, very often, the deep center's last and loudest attempt to be heard, the owner finally pounding on the wall of the lit room because every quieter signal was ignored. The emptiness she felt was not the absence of a life. It was the presence of the one who had never been allowed to live it. And so, almost without deciding to, the school teacher did the one thing that begins to change everything. She turned toward it. After the 5th or 6th time the dream came, instead of shaking it off with her morning coffee and folding it back into the day's small duties, she sat with it. She let herself wonder, on purpose, what the figure in the unentered room had been about to say. And then she did something she had never done in 68 years of living from the lit room. She picked up a pen, and instead of asking what she should write, or what would be appropriate, or what anyone would think, she simply asked the question that the whole ache had been circling. What do I want? And she sat there, in the silence of the quiet house, and for the first time in her life she waited for the answer to come not from the committee, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere she had spent a lifetime overruling. This is the threshold. This is the entire turning of a life, and it does not look like much from the outside. It is just a woman at a table with a pen, learning, impossibly late and not too late, how to ask her own depths a question, and then be quiet long enough to hear the reply. What came at first was almost nothing, a flicker, a small, embarrassed, almost childish wish that she immediately wanted to dismiss as foolish. She had always, since she was a girl, wanted to paint, not to be a painter, nothing so grand, just to put color on a surface and watch what happened, the way she had wanted to as a child before someone, she could not even remember who, had let her know without words that this was not a serious thing for a serious person to do. She had buried it so thoroughly that it took her a moment to even recognize it as her own. And the manager in the lit room rose up at once with its full battery of shoulds. You are 68. It is too late. You would be bad at it. What would people think, a retired schoolteacher buying paints at her age? Every one of those voices was the committee, and she recognized them now for what they were, and for the first time she did not obey. She bought the paints. It was the most radical act of her life, and it looked, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. Now I want to be careful here, because the temptation at this point is to make it a small and tidy story. Woman retires, woman takes up painting, woman is happy. That is not the truth, and it is not what Jung meant, and it would be a lie that betrays everyone who has stood where she stood, because turning toward the self is not a hobby, and it is not a reward. It is a reorientation of the entire personality, and it exacts a price, and the price is the part almost no one is willing to pay. To begin answering to your own deep center, you have to stop answering to everyone you have spent your life pleasing, and they will not like it. The manager has been keeping all of them comfortable for decades. The moment the owner takes the throne, every relationship that was built on the obedient version of you goes into crisis. This is where her real descent began, and it is the part the tidy version leaves out. Her children, grown now, had a mother who was always available, always agreeable, always organized around their needs. And as she began slowly to organize her days around her own emerging life, they felt the shift, and they did not like it. Her daughter, used to a mother who would drop anything to help with the grandchildren, found her suddenly, gently, unavailable on a Tuesday because she was painting, and the daughter's first response was not joy at her mother's awakening. It was hurt. And then it was a quiet, wounded anger, because the unspoken contract of her whole life had just been rewritten without her consent. The friends who had known the reliable, accommodating woman found her harder to read, less quick to agree, occasionally and shockingly willing to say no. The town that had a fixed idea of who she was felt that idea shifting under it, and the town, like all towns, preferred the version it already knew. She discovered, as everyone who begins this work discovers, that the people who loved the obedient you are rarely the ones who will celebrate your freedom. They loved the manager. They had a relationship with the costume. And the owner stepping forward feels, to them, like a kind of betrayal, like a death, like losing a person they were sure they knew. Jung never pretended this part was gentle. He said that individuation makes a person lonely for a while, and now you understand why. Not because the work is selfish, but because the world is organized around your having handed away your throne, and reclaiming it disturbs every arrangement built on the assumption that you never would. There is grief in it, real grief. The grief of disappointing people you love. The grief of discovering that some of them loved your compliance more than they loved you. The school teacher wept more than once in that year, not from regret at having begun, but from the sheer cost of it, the strange and lonely cost of finally becoming the owner of a house everyone else had grown used to using as their own. But here is what nobody warns you about the loneliness of this particular descent. It is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of no longer being alone with yourself in the way you used to be. Because as she kept turning toward the center, as she kept asking, "What do I want?" and waiting for the answer, the dark hallway began to fill with a presence she was no longer afraid of. The figure from the dream stopped vanishing the moment before it spoke. One night, in the dream, she finally walked all the way into the unentered room, and the calm presence looked at her with that terrible tenderness, and this time it did not disappear. It simply held her gaze, and she understood in the wordless way you understand things in dreams that it had been her all along, not a stranger, not a guide sent from somewhere else, the woman she would have been if she had ever once chosen herself, standing patiently at the center of her own house, waiting through 68 years of should for her to finally turn around. She woke from that dream not frightened and not sad, but with a quiet she had never felt before, a clean, level quiet, the quiet of a person who has finally come home to the one room in the house that was always hers. This is the heart of what Jung meant by individuation, and it is worth being precise about, because it is so easily mistaken for its cheap imitations. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not becoming a better, more polished, more impressive version of the person the committee approved of. It is the opposite. It is the slow, often painful process of dethroning the manager and learning to live from the owner, of shifting the center of your life from the anxious ego in the lit room to the deep self in the dark, of moving, decision by decision, from a life run by should to a life answerable to something truer underneath. It does not make you selfish, though it will be called selfish by everyone who profited from your self-erasure. It does not make you cold. It makes you whole, which is a different and far more disturbing thing because a whole person cannot be reliably managed, cannot be counted on to always choose the committee, cannot be talked out of the life they have finally agreed to live. And Jung was careful, always, to say what it is not, because the ego is endlessly clever at counterfeiting this. The lit room, threatened with losing its throne, will try to convince you that it has already done the work. It will declare that it has found its true self, and then go right on living from should, only now with a more spiritual vocabulary. This is the trap, and I would call it the counterfeit center. The ego dressing up as the self while changing nothing underneath. The mark of the real thing is not certainty, and it is not pride. It is humility, and it is the willingness to keep asking the question and keep waiting for the answer, knowing the answer will sometimes ask of you the very things you most want to avoid. The owner of the house does not shout. It does not insist you are special. It speaks, when you finally learn to listen, in a voice so quiet and so certain that you will wonder how you spent your whole life unable to hear it. Jung had a line for the difference between the two ways of living. He said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." The school teacher had looked outside for 68 years, reading the faces of the committee for the answer to who she was. She was only now, at the very end of the afternoon, learning to look in. I want to leave you with the question she had to answer, because it is the same one waiting for you, and I suspect you already feel it, the way she felt it at the window. So here it is, and I would ask you to write it in the comments, not as agreement, but as a line you are holding yourself to from this day forward. I will stop asking who I should be and start answering to who I am. Write that and mean it, because the writing of it is itself a small turning toward the center, a single vote after all the years of voting the other way. Watch what happened to her in the time she had left, because it is the only ending that does not lie. She did not become a great painter. She was, by any honest measure, a perfectly ordinary one. That was never the point, and she knew it now. What changed was not the quality of the paintings, but the location of the woman making them. For the first time in her life, she was living from the inside out instead of the outside in. The decisions, small and large, that filled her final years were no longer arrived at by polling the committee. They were arrived at by a quiet consultation with the center. The deep self that had waited so long and asked for so little except, finally, to be allowed to live the life it was meant to live. She mended some of the relationships that her awakening had strained, and a few of them, the honest ones, became deeper than they had ever been, because for the first time she was actually present in them, a real person instead of a costume. Others did not survive, and she let them go, with grief but without apology, because she understood at last that a relationship that requires you to stay in the dark hallway is not a relationship at all. She had years, not decades, but for the first time, they were hers. She was, at 68, and then 69, and then 70, finally living. And this brings us back to the presence I told you about at the beginning, the one who has been watching your whole life, the one who saw you take the safe job and marry the sensible person and swallow the words that mattered, and who disagreed silently with so much of it. I told you that someone inside you has been waiting. I want you to understand now who that someone actually is. It is not a critic. It is not a ghost. It is not a stranger at all, though it has been dressed as one in your dreams for as long as you have refused to look. It is you, the truest you, the one the committee never got to vote on, the architect of the house standing patiently in the dark hallway, holding the door of the unentered room, waiting with a patience that has outlasted every should you ever obeyed. The stranger who has been waiting your whole life was never a stranger. It was the one you were always meant to become, standing exactly where it has always stood, asking nothing of you except that you finally turn around. You do not have to have done it right. The school teacher did everything right, and it nearly cost her her life. You do not have to wait until you are 68, and you do not have to despair if you already are, because the one in the hallway does not check the clock. It has been waiting the whole time, and it will wait a little longer, until the day you set down the committee's verdict on who you are and go, at last, into the room you have been circling your whole life, and meet the one who has known you all along. Turn around. It is not too late. It waited faithfully, and it waits for you still. If you are ready to go deeper into this work, watch my video on the part of yourself you buried just to be loved, where I show you how to begin recovering the very strength you exiled to keep the peace. The owner of the house is not the only thing waiting in the dark for you to come home. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.